Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth and final Centering Indigenous Pedagogies in Mathematics Education session for 2023 to 2024. This session is on Oral and Experiential Stories at Indigenous Pedagogies for Mathematical Flourishing. And I'm going to pass this off to Cynthia.
Hi, thank you very much. Welcome everyone to our session, fourth of the series and the final one for this academic year. And I want to invite Leyton to be to introduce himself and the rest of the series and a land acknowledgement. Leyton.
Thanks, Cynthia. I welcome everyone. We are, as everyone is at this time of year, saying, what are we doing? Because spring is here. And so we're just so excited to engage together with you in the Centering Indigenous Pedagogies and Math Education series. I'm Leyton Schnellert, and my amazing colleague, Dr. Cynthia Nicol, was just sharing beforehand. And so together with our research chairs, we came together and said, what can we do? What needs to be offered? And so I'm joining you from Syilx territory, and I've had the great fortune to live and learn and play here for the last 14 years. In particular, I've had the chance to collaborate with elders and knowledge holders from the Penticton Indian Band. And many of the photos that you see, in fact, all of the photos that you see here are connected to some of the partnership work that we've been doing, where I've had the opportunity to learn local Syilx math and science, traditional ecological knowledge in terms of learning. And so the opportunities to understand how math is part of stewardship, how math is part of living, and how math is part of reconciliation has been incredibly powerful for me, and I know that you in your own territories are engaging in that similar work. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a map of what we colonially call British Columbia, but that recognizes the nations of British Columbia, and we have superimposed the Sinixt Nation as they have recently been recognized in the federal courts and are no longer considered extinct. Welcome everyone, and we invite you at this time, if you would find your fingers to move to in any way connect to recognize the land or the peoples of your local territories, your First Nations, and that would help us locate yourselves. We also recognize that there are folks here from outside of British Columbia, and if this is not a familiar practice to you, this is a decolonizing approach where we recognize the original peoples and places and how the language and the land and the people are inseparable. We have some cool partners. Yay, partners. I should have acknowledged Dr. Joanne Archibald as well. And so Joanne and Cynthia and I, Janice Novakowski, we're just hanging out here together, everybody, thinking about what can we do in our practice to make change with our partners, the Indigenous Math Network, the David Robitaille International STEM Education Network that works with Cynthia, Dogwood 25 that works with Joanne and Cynthia. And we're so grateful to the BC Ministry of Education for these last 3 years for supporting us with some funds for this series. And finally, I'm so fortunate to chair the Rural Education Advisory. And one of the things we've been able to do with this webinar series is recognize the exceptional work that's happening all over, and that often in small rural remote communities, some of the finest land-based practices are happening, and we're able to shine a light by coming together. Thanks to all of our partners. Thanks to Cynthia and Joanne and Janice for coming on board for this incredible project.
Yes, I'd like to also acknowledge that we, through UBC, the Vancouver campus, are located on the unceded lands of the Musqueam people, and that some of us also live and work on the Musqueam people's unceded lands, as well as those of Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.
So our focus for this session is centering Indigenous pedagogies in math education related to oral and experiential stories. And this series, you can see this beautiful carved mask here, is by Reg Davidson, who's a Haida artist. The mask is called Two-Face Gogi, Transformation mask that he carved. And Reg comes from a long line of carvers and artists and he's well known for his carved masks and poles and canoes. And he's a member of the Haida dance group called the Rainbow Creek Dancers. You may be familiar with his work or his brother's work, Robert Davidson. But Joanne Yovanovich and I first met, read his work. Well, Joanne knows of his work more further back than I, but we met his transformation mask when he was carving it, and he was trying to figure out how to put the hinges on so that the mask would open and reveal this human inside from the Gogit who is on the outside. So if we look just kind of back at the Gogit is like a really wild, spirited, supernatural being. Its spirit is too strong to die. And on the inside, I think I have an image here. On the inside, you can see that the human, once it opens up, is about the length of a human body. It's a beautiful, huge transformation mask that really brings us together, thinking about Indigenous community and culture and mathematics for our series. And the images I have here of Haida Gwaii and the land and the map of Haida Gwaii give you a sense of how the art and the language and the culture are very much all connected. So we have a couple of people who are from Haida Gwaii who are going to be part of the keynote and part of our series today, and we're really excited about that aspect of our work. We are, as you know, the fourth in a series of four other sessions. The first was around mathematical moments of becoming Indigenous Storywork ready, and then we had the power of teaching and learning, mathematics through land and place. And last month, we had culturally responsive math education across contexts, where we looked at Minecraft as a way of thinking about a new world of Minecraft that focused on Indigenous Coast Salish peoples' principles and values. And this session is around oral and experiential stories for mathematical flourishing. We have our presenters here, and I will invite Joanne Archibald to say a few words about our presenters.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia. Yes, we have two Joannes today. Me, Joanne Archibald. I'm also known as Kwam Kwam Huyam, a member of Stalo Nation, and I have ancestry in Statliam Nation as well. And I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of British Columbia. I'm honored to introduce our presenters today. And first, we will have Billy Yovanovich. Billy is a member of the South Eagle clan of Skidegate Haida Gwaii. His Haida name, and I apologize, but I'm giving it a good try to pronounce, Kuchlanu is his Haida name. Billy is an accomplished artist who has studied Haida art with Haida artists, well-renowned Robert Davidson, the late Ben Davidson, master carvers Tim Boyko and Garner Moody. The inspiration for Billy's Haida designs come from Haida stories, and especially the supernatural beings in those stories. Billy's work is recognized and displayed in many museums and galleries and communities throughout Haida Gwaii, the province, and elsewhere. And joining Billy in this session is his proud mother, Joanne Yovanovich, who is also a member of the South Eagle clan of Skidegate on Haida Gwaii. Joanne's Haida name is Tanud Jad. Joanne began as a full-day kindergarten teacher and vice principal before becoming principal of Skidina High Elementary School at Haida Gwaii. Currently, she holds the position of principal of Indigenous education for the school district. Joanne is committed to supporting all students on Haida Gwaii and believes that culturally responsive education is a key to student success. So after Billy's presentation, we will have 3 curriculum responders, and I'll introduce them now. First, we will have Tamara Shand, and Tamara was born and lives on the ancestral and unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and is privileged to be able to continue to do so. Her ancestors hail from India, England, West Africa, and China, all via the Caribbean islands of Trinidad and Tobago. As a former journalist, Tamara is deeply interested in language and story and their connection to human nature. Tamara teaches grade 1 and 2 French immersion at Strathcona Elementary in Vancouver. Then we will have Courtney Fox. Courtney is an Indigenous educator from the Blood Reserve in Alberta. Courtney works on Tsuut'ina Nation Chief Big Belly Middle School and recognizes the importance of understanding and addressing social issues with sensitivity to the historical context and ongoing struggles faced by Indigenous communities. Courtney teaches grades 7 and 8 math and leadership. Courtney has a passion for helping students find their love for mathematics through practical life and real-world challenges and opportunities. Then we'll also have our very own Dr. Cynthia Nicol, who holds the professorship, the David Robitaille Math and Science, the professorship for the David Robitaille Math and Science area. And Cynthia has taught high school at Haida Gwaii for a number of years before coming to UBC. So those will be our presenters. So we're really looking forward now to hearing Billy Yovanovich share some of his stories about Haida art and mathematics.
Hello, everyone. I'm Billy Yovanovich, up and coming Haida artist on Haida Gwaii here. I'm a member of the Joth Eagle clan. We're located from the west coast of Haida Gwaii to Haina and also in Skidegate at Kai. And today I'd like to share a story, which is a snippet kind of from the Raven Traveling Saga, which is, you know, this is just a small sliver of what our, I guess, essentially would be our creation story kind of. This is a little snippet into it. And so this story is called Ulanai. And Ulanai in Haida translates to my special friend. And so in this story, we have Raven and Eagle. And Raven and Eagle, they're flying around and they're coming through the clouds, and there's a clearing. And they notice there's a little clearing in the trees on the land by a creek. And so they decide, oh, well, we'll land here, we'll have a look, we'll check things out. And just one thing I wanted to kind of iterate too before I get too far into it is this story, it probably predates Raven's contact with finding the first men. And so as Raven and Eagle, they land down by this creek. They're kind of checking things out and walking along, and they're traveling along. And as they're coming through the creek, they're noticing a clearing in the trees, and they come through some ferns. As they part, everything parts out of their way as they're walking through, and they notice they come to this longhouse. And they're both kind of looking at each other like, oh, gee, I wonder what's going on in here. And so they, being curious, they head into this longhouse. And as they enter the longhouse, they notice, there's no fire going. There's kind of desolate in there, and they look around, and there's the way I've been told, the way he's described, he's a Chinai, which is grandfather in our language. So it kind of personifies this being as being this kind of older looking man, and he's sitting there with his head down and his hair, it's hanging over in front of his face. And they come in, and both Eagle and Raven are kind of looking around, and then they see him, and they yell out to this Chinai, and he sits there with his head down, and he's kind of almost unresponsive in a way. And they try a few times to kind of communicate with him, and they're looking around in the longhouse, and Raven finds a Gooding Eye shell, a sea urchin shell, and it doesn't have any of the spines around it. It's just smooth with the small bumps around the shell. And he sees it kind of over by the Chinai, and he looks at the Chinai, and you can see on his back, you can see the bumps of his vertebrae kind of like poking out from him. And Raven grabs the Gooding Eye shell, and he takes it and he rubs it up and down the Chinai spine, and it causes the Chinai to go from bent over, and he sits up, and they don't really ever get to see his face. His hair kind of stays in the way, and he sits up, and Raven and Eagle kind of, they're taken aback that he finally responded, and they're looking at each other, and they're trying to get his attention again, and he doesn't say anything. He's just kind of sitting there, kind of unresponsive, at least to any contact with them. And so Raven and Eagle kind of, they give up, and Raven puts down the Gooding Eye shell back down beside him, and they decide, okay, well, we're going to take off. And as they head out, back out the longhouse, like any village here, the longhouse was down by the ocean. And so as they come out, they look, and they notice all of a sudden the tide, it's way out there. And Raven and Eagle kind of look at each other and go, oh, well, we can go gather and get ourselves a snack. And the tide ends up going out so far. It said they go out to the farthest tidal pools, and they're actually collecting codfish. So they're all excited with their fish, these codfish that they have, and they head back over to the creek, back to where they landed, and they set up a fire, and they both start dressing their fish to barbecue their fish over a fire. And Raven, if you've heard any stories before, Raven, he's a little hasty at things, and he's got good intentions, but it's not always the best follow through. And so they prepare their fish, and Raven, he's hungry now, so he just kind of slaps his together on his cooking sticks, and he's got it set over his fire, and he's got it right on the fire almost, because he thinks, oh, I'm going to get it close, and it's going to cook quickly. I'll be able to eat. I'm so hungry. He's kind of looking over at Eagle, and Eagle's taking his time, setting everything up, and taking the proper steps to cook his fish properly. And while Raven's kind of spacing out, he notices, oh geez, his fish it's starting to burn, and it's all black, and it's all kind of it's not very appetizing, and he's looking at it like, oh geez, I really kind of messed that up. And he looks over at Eagles, and Eagle's turning his fish, and Raven's watching the fat drip into the fire off of Eagle's fish, and he's kind of salivating, going, oh geez, I wish that I want that to be mine. So he's sitting there, and in Raven fashion, he thinks, well, I gotta come up with a plan how I'm gonna get this fish. And so he kind of shoots up from his fire, and he sets his fish away from the flame, and he's kind of got it just sitting there, and he tells Eagle, oh, I'm gonna take off. I'm gonna go down the creek, and I just want to kind of have a look, see, get a lay of the land and where we are again. Eagle kind of, he has this inkling that he's up to something, but he just kind of goes, okay, yeah, you go do your thing, Raven. And so Raven gets up, and he heads down, and there's a bend in the creek, and so he goes out of sight, and Raven's kind of walking along with his head down, thinking away to himself, wondering, how am I going to trick Eagle into giving me his fish? And so he's thinking, and then all of a sudden he has a light bulb moment, and he's kind of, aha. He turns around, and he starts running back to Eagle, and he purposely falls and trips, and he gets himself kind of dirty. His feathers are all ruffled, and he comes running back in kind of a frenzy, and he looks all frantic, and he tells Eagle, oh, Eagle, Chumos is coming down the creek. And Chumos in Haida, it translates to living log or supernatural snag. So it's kind of like a supernatural deadhead in a sense, but it's personified as this kind of moving being. And Eagle kind of looks at Raven like, oh, there's Chumos coming down the creek. And Raven said, yeah, no, he's coming. And he was saying he wants our fish as payment to be on his creek. And Eagle just kind of nods and goes, okay, yeah. Well, when he comes, I'll be ready. And Raven says, I'm gonna go back up around the bend, and I'm gonna go check where he is, so I can come back and tell you when he's getting close. So Eagle he really has this feeling that Raven's trying to pull something over on him. And so he's watching him in the corner of his eye, and he sees him go around the bend, but Raven doesn't know Eagle he was kind of tailing him just enough that he could see him around the bend. And Raven transforms into Chumos, and he turns into this big being. And he's kind of down the way from him, and he starts trudging along through the creek. And he comes towards Eagle. Eagle can feel him as he's coming. The ground's kind of shaking, and he puts on a big intimidating voice, and he says, Eagle, you have to pay me with your fish to be here on my creek. This is my creek here. And Eagle says, oh yeah, I'll feed you my fish. And Raven, still transformed as Chumos, he's kind of shocked and like, oh geez, that was so easy. And he's kind of excited, and he's okay. And then Eagle he looks at him, and he says, but I have one condition, Chumos. So Chumos says, well, what's your condition? And he says, I want you to close your eyes when I feed you your fish. I don't want you to bite my fingers off when I put it in your mouth. And so Chumos, he doesn't think anything of it. He just says, okay, yeah, no, I'll close my eyes. I won't bite your fingers off when you place your fish into my mouth. And so Eagle, he's watching Chumos, and he says, okay. And he reaches for his fish, and he turns, and he's watching Chumos close his eyes tight. He reaches down in front of his fire, and he grabs 2 hot rocks, and he turns to Chumos, and he rubs them in his face. And then as he's rubbing the hot rocks into his face, Raven starts to transform back into Raven, and he's got feathers everywhere, and he singes, and he's letting out, and he's cawing, and he runs off, hops down towards the creek, and he dives in to cool his face off. And Eagle turns, and he's kind of chuckling at him. And he says, in English, he says to him, "You'll have to try better than that, my special friend," because he knew he was watching him the whole time. And so he knew what was going to unfold. And so this story of Will and I, my special friend, I told this story as an idea of how math, it's our special friend. Like, it's in everything, like especially me being an artist, it's in everything that I do. In our cultural way of life, it's in everything that we do. Like certain times of the year you go gather certain things, or certain times of the day the tide is good, and you know that all involves math and measurements and all of these things. And so it seemed fitting to kind of reference to mathematics as our special friend, especially having been fortunate enough to be working with my mom and Cynthia for quite a few years now. So I see it kind of in everything. And so this is my first pole that I carved for, well, the first pole I was the head carver of, I guess I should say. This is, her name in Haida is Chihu Jinja, and she is low tide woman. And as you can see, she's adorned with, she has shells and other sea life that you would find at the tide line. And this piece, you know, it had doing this piece from inception to the creation of it. Like, it started out as a drawing that was, I don't know, here's the drawing. The drawing, this was 8 inches by 3 inches. And so, you know, it was kind of to scale, which slowly turned into 8 feet by 3 feet. And we have our center lines. We have one down the middle of the face, and then if we have the slide of the pole, yeah, here you can, down the side here, you can kind of see there's another center line. So it's, the pole was measured out into quarters as we started, like it started as an octagon to a circle, and then we have our center lines, and then the pole slowly kind of progresses from here, where we start to take in the profile. So then we're cutting out the forehead, the nose, the mouth. You can see her breasts are taking shape. And so I'm getting all of these different levels started. And, you know, there's a lot of math going on in there that you wouldn't think, oh, I need this same depth here to the other side, and, you know, to make the hands look, you know, similar. Like, with what all the years of carving I've done, I've learned we have, as carvers, we have about 1/4 inch of wiggle room. Any more, and the human eye picks it up, and you notice things aren't sitting the same depth or the same height. And so, you know, like, it's not exact, but it's got to be quite close, or the eye notices, hey, this one of these things is not like the other. But this piece was a labor of love. It was a lot of learning that I did personally, because being the head guy, you know, it was daunting. Like, you know, only 8 foot by 3 foot, but in the round there was a lot of wood there, and it was a lot of firsts for me in this project. And it's you know, it's very special having this be something that is in our village at our health center. And you can notice down the leg here, I have starfish, there's chitin, limpet, 2 sand dollars. So these were all, these are all things that you find at the tide line. And then her hair. I don't know if we have a good shot of her hair, but her hair comes to 8.
That's sort of it.
Yeah, it comes to 8 points anyway, and it's to represent octopus legs. So that's why her hair is red. Yeah, there you can kind of see a little more of the hair there. So yeah, I tried to hammer home the theme that this is that this was a tidal being, and I painted it in a way, like with it being a public installation. You want people to feel your art, like you want it to be alive, and I kind of gave it a little bit of a realism look, like the barnacles aren't just one color. The abalone, I tried to make it look like an abalone, and it was to make it kind of interactive, like kids, especially with kids. Kids want to go by. I want kids to touch it and feel it and find these things that, we grow up seeing all of our life.
The looks on the children on the left there, looking at the pool, it's just amazing.
When you get to this stage, like you see it, like it's not just a round piece of wood. There was a lot of things that happened, and when we're using calipers and we're taking our marks from one side to the other, we just think of it as measurements. We don't think of it as like, you're subtracting from one side to match the other. And there's these aspects of math that, before, when I was younger, it wasn't something you thought of. And it's something I hope that gets translated over into education, because, I was once the young guy kind of learning about math, and when you have it in art or in, like with Low Tide Woman, with the gathering of seafood or harvesting of cedar bark or anything, you can have, there's a certain time of year you gotta go, or low tide, certain time of day, you only have so much time in the day. Like it's all, it can all become quite technical when you really think about it, but it's it's something that you're just like, oh yeah, I got to go do this. You don't think that you're crunching numbers, or it's not this strenuous solve for X thing.
Yeah, it's a different kind of engaging with mathematics, I think. So thank you, Billy. You've given us an oral story with Ulanai, and an experiential story in terms of the inception, the thinking of the design for Low Tide Woman, and the story of supernatural being, Low Tide Woman. And now we have 3 curriculum responders, 3 educators who will just say something about what insights were inspired by Billy's stories, oral and experiential. So we'll start with Tamara, who's a grade 1-2 teacher. So Tamara.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So I am presenting to you on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I was born here, even though my people come from the Caribbean, and I was raised here and went to elementary school here. I'm teaching grade 1-2 French immersion in the neighborhood of Strathcona, which, as it happens, is one of the oldest residential neighborhoods in Vancouver. And since it is one of the oldest neighborhoods, I think it's kind of like the starting point in this city for colonization. And we also happen to have at this school a very high population of Indigenous students. And our neighborhood, in fact, has about a 10% population of Indigenous students, Indigenous peoples, compared to 2.5% in the rest of Vancouver. So it feels particularly salient for us as a staff to be decolonizing and indigenizing in order to support our student population. As I mentioned, I come from as Joanne mentioned in my introduction, thank you. I come from the Caribbean. My family comes from the Caribbean, which is an oral storytelling culture. So I feel very much connecting to stories. One of the things I learned connecting with Billy in preparation for this presentation, thank you for connecting with me, is that there are important protocols to follow when we are using oral stories. So one of the things I learned is that, first of all, we need to ask for permission. And then also it's important to be taught the story. So I can't tell you how I've implemented this lesson because I haven't been taught or gifted or given permission to use this story, but I wanted to just give you an example of how I might be inspired by the story of Ulanai. So looking at this story, I was struck with the cooking aspect of it. So children are learning a sense of time. And they're also, in my experience, because I teach quite young children, tend to be a little bit impatient. So I thought that would be a good theme to connect to. The first thing that I would do to prepare them for the story is to get them story work ready. And I would like to acknowledge the teachings of Joanne, who I have learned from indirectly through her writing. So to get story work ready, I would focus on one particular principle, and that would be responsibility, because my students tend to be learning to listen to each other. So I would focus on responsibility in terms of being responsible for listening to each other and for working together. So having set that stage, I would also want to place the story. So I would want to make sure to tell my students all about the storyteller, where that storyteller came from, and where the story originated from. And then also, because young children are not necessarily thinking conceptually and in metaphor, I would want to really give them the vocabulary to talk about what we're talking about. So I would need to make sure they understand the concept of patience, make sure they understand the concepts of temperature, time, so that they have the vocabulary to talk about the metaphors that we're going to be using. And then also, because these young students are still very concrete, I would want to give them the concrete experiences so that they can start to think in metaphor. So we're preparing the foundation for them to be thinking about these stories in a much deeper level. So now that we've laid that foundation, we've prepared them for the story, we've given them the vocabulary, and we have we prepared them for the story and given them the vocabulary. Then the next thing I would do is start to ask them, what if? Because that really engages their curiosity. What if we tried cooking two different things? What if we cooked oatmeal and we had one on a really low setting and had one on a really high setting? And then just demonstrate that for them, perhaps projecting it. So I would do a whole class demonstration so that they're not crowding, and then project it somewhere so that they can see and they can discuss, and then weaving throughout the whole demonstration, the whole temperature demonstration, referring to each pot as this might be Eagle's pot and this might be Raven's pot. And then as they're observing what happens when you really apply high temperature and high pressure and kind of try to be hasty, much like Raven was in the story of Ulanai, what happens? What is the result when we're impatient and when we rush and when we don't slow down and have the patience to get those juicy salmon that Eagle was making. So now that we have that concrete experience, and they have the vocabulary, then we're able to start asking questions to them, like, how might this activity be connected to the story of Ulanai? How do you think Raven might have felt in this story? Does anyone have a connection to Raven's experience? And then we are engaging them to think more conceptually about the mathematical experience of what happens when we're looking at temperature and time. So there's the mathematical aspect where we're looking at temperature, time, and then pulling out of that now, where we can start thinking about metaphor. We can start talking about the core competency of personal and social responsibility and how we can slow things down, and we can take a breath and we can take a break and maybe develop some strategies and even connect to our own personal experiences of when we've rushed something and what the result of that was, and connecting to the experiences of Raven and Eagle.
Perfect. Good. Thank you very much, Tamara. Those are excellent points. Okay. And now we have Courtney, who will provide some insights at the middle school level. And after our curriculum responders, we'll have some time for questions from you. So get your questions lined up here. All right, Courtney.
Hi, as Cynthia said, my name is Courtney, or as my family knows me, Eshbiaki, which means dancing girl in Blackfoot. I'm currently completing my master's of mathematics education through UBC, which is actually how I found this. And I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which include Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as the Métis Nations, and all the other people who make their homes in Treaty 7. So right now I'm actually on maternity leave. I just had a baby 7 months ago, but when I'm not on maternity, I've spent my actual entire career working on the Tsuut'ina Nation, which just is on the south side of Calgary, as well, in various roles, but most recently for the last 4 years as a grade 7-8 mathematics teacher. And then just going back to my master's, something that I found interesting throughout this is that the stories and cultures of Indigenous people that I've learned both from now Billy and also taking courses through Haida is that the stories are vastly different than those stories that are taught to me growing up in the Blackfoot community, and also just working on the Tsuut'ina Nation. So because of this, we've discussed in wanting to show educators how we can use stories from outside of our region, such as the one Billy shared today, to relate to stories that are told within our region, which is kind of what I'm going to do now. So the story Billy told reminded me of a story that my papa told me growing up pretty much every single time that I saw him or he visited me. And it's a story that explains how the rock, this rock is in Okotoks, Alberta, was split in two. I'm going to tell you like the short version of it because I only have a few minutes, just to give you an idea of how I related the two stories. So it's called Nappy and the Rock. So on a summer day, Nappy, who is a supernatural trickster, rested on the rock. He told the rock to keep his robe in return for letting him rest there. It was nice, it was beautiful out. Suddenly, like in Alberta, the weather's always changing. So the weather changed and it was windy and the rain was beginning to fall. So Nappy asked the rock for his robe back. Nappy said, or the rock said no, and this made Nappy mad. In his rage, he took the robe back and he walked away. As he was walking away, he heard a loud noise from behind him, and when he looked behind him, he saw that the rock was actually rolling towards him. So he started running for his life. His friends, the deer and the bison, tried to help him by stepping in front of the rock to stop the rock, but it continued to roll on. Nappy was desperate and he called for the bats' help. Fortunately, the bats were able to help and hit the rock just right, splitting it in two and stopping it from rolling. So that's kind of like the small gist of it. This story is to teach us how to have caution when taking things back, which is important when we talk about Nappy, because stories the Nappy stories are there to teach us about balance, because he often goes to extremes and fails to maintain that balance. Similarly, how Raven struggled to achieve that balance when cooking his food too fast and burning it, and then becoming sort of like a trickster to the eagle. If you can go to the next slide. So calling this kind of keeping the balance in our life in mathematics. This isn't something that I have taught, but it's more of just how to relate the stories that we hear in these kind of webinars and from elsewhere, and how we can relate it back to our classrooms. So the curricular connection that we've made through these is 2 stories is through 2-step equations. And that big idea is that in order for our equations to work, it needs to be balanced. So if we add something to one side, we have to add it to the other. If we take something from one side, we must do it to the other side as well. So questions that we could go through and discuss with our students was, what happens to our equations when we don't follow this balance? Or how does this relate to the story of Nappy and the rock in my instance? So like Nappy gave his robe to the rock in return for that resting place, which was keeping that balance. But when he took his robe back, that it was no longer balanced. And then how can you relate it to the eagle and the raven and how they cooked their food? So the raven struggling to achieve that balance and cooking his food and being jealous of the eagle's food. And then just to further this on, a potential extension of this activity is finding a story within their own lives that may have similar properties, or a story that they could pull mathematics out to, whether it be with this 2-step equations or with a previously taught concept. The next slide. And then because I'm doing my master's in BC, I've kind of, this slide and the next slide, I'm showing how this relates to both BC curriculum and the Alberta curriculum, because that's what I normally work with. So I'm not super familiar with the BC curriculum, but I just was going through it. So the curricular competencies, which is engaging in problem solving experiences and First Nations communities and local communities and other cultures, connecting to mathematical concepts to each other and other areas and personal interests, and then incorporate First Peoples worldviews and perspectives. And then I just have the actual content there below. And then the next slide, which Alberta's curriculum is a little bit more outdated than BC's curriculum. So the mathematical processes is connecting to mathematical ideas, to other concepts in mathematics, and to everyday experiences and to other disciplines. And if you look in the background of that program of studies, it does mention working with First Nations perspectives and stories and oral practices. And then the content for grade 7 and 8 is a little bit different than the BC curriculum, but I just have it there as well, which is 1-step and 2-step problems essentially. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. I mean, that's a good example of taking or even having us think about how oral stories are very specific to place, or can be very specific to place. And both you and Tamara talked about the placeness of the story. So you've taken and been inspired by Billy's story to think about a story from your own context that has a similar teachings to it, and which would also maybe be familiar, the students would be familiar with that rock, and then maybe others would be also familiar with the story. So a very nice example of how you're bringing those together in a different context. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so I have now taken on the task of just making some connections at the secondary level. And I'm going to connect with the Low Tide Woman and the story and the experiential story that Billy told related to Low Tide Woman. And with that, I was thinking of cycles. So I have a question that I am asking everybody to think about is in the chat, is to think about what examples of cycles can you think of? So what comes in cycles that you could think of? If you could put that in the chat, then that might kind of get us started in thinking about cycles and different kinds of cycles. And this image here might give you some hints about cycles in terms of maybe tides as the cycle of tides. Might also connect with thinking about low tide woman. Here, the tide doesn't look so low. Well, good, we've got some examples here in the chat. Let me just go to the chat so I can see it. Oh, there we go. Good. Seasons, yes, seasons, the body, tides, life, moon, cycles, food. Excellent, good. Okay, so you've thought of everything I thought of already. So I can just zip through this part here. So those are all very good examples of thinking about cycles. And we live in cycles, and thinking about cycles is very much a part of thinking about mathematics. And it's about being mathematical, is about noticing these cycles, what changes, what stays the same. So it's hard not to be mathematical when we're trying to live in particular places and survive and live a good life. So here is an example of seasons and a seasonal calendar, which many of you thought of in terms of cycles. The left is in Haida language and the right is the English version of it, but you can see how it's divided into the months, 12 months, but also how going across the seasons that there are various different fish that are available for harvesting, and some that and the period of time that they're available for harvesting, and how those overlap with other kinds of shellfish and other kinds of fish that might be available to us when the tide is out. So seasons and the seasonal cycles would be an example of a cycle that I might be able to draw upon mathematically in my class. We might also think about the Pacific salmon and its life cycle and how that is changing across different areas, across the coast, or if it's an inland river or different bodies of water, how do fish and their cycles change or develop, or how are they different based on the place? And even how are they different based on climate change and the increasing temperature of the water? How is that different? Or even in different tidal zones, what is the life cycle of the salmon? And we might compare that to our own life cycles, as someone mentioned in the chat. We could think about the cycle of day and night, and thinking about the eclipse. I'm not sure if anybody, if you're not from BC, if you're from Ontario, maybe you had a chance to view the eclipse. I just heard all the amazing things that people were saying about it. But this is a really interesting little video that I'll just show you here of how this life cycle changes here. So you can see the cycle of light and day as it moves across this flat map of the Earth. And you can notice that there's different degrees of darkness on the cycle, the sinusoidal curve. And that's just kind of looking at where darkness and light is occurring at those various places on the Earth. But again, that is a cycle returning of light and dark in our different time zones. Here is also looking at tides, also mentioned in the chat. These are the tides, tidal phases in Vancouver, but you can see the up and down of the tides over particular days. Here today, April 9th. You can see when the high tide was and when the low tide is. But you can also see that it isn't exactly the same. Those are different ways of looking at tides in different places. Some places in the world only have two tides, a high tide and a low tide. Some places in the world have tides that are always the same. The low tide is almost the same as the high tide. But on the Pacific coast and on Haida Gwaii and in Vancouver, we have this semi-diurnal tide where the low tides and the high tides aren't necessarily the same height. So it's not necessarily balanced, but it goes through a similar cycle. So tides and how we graph those over time could be a place to engage in some mathematical investigations and inquiry. And another thing that I thought of that related to the low tide woman is a project called the Coup with the Sea Otter Project. And this is kind of based on thinking about more than 150 years ago when there was a balance between the sea, before the sea otter fur trade began, when there was a balance between the sea otters and the sea urchins that they ate. But after the fur trade and almost the extinction of the otters, the sea urchins, which the sea otters eat, grew tremendously. And so the ocean floors all along the coast had these beautiful looking sea otters without anything to eat them. And the sea otters themselves would eat on the kelp and destroy these beautiful kelp forests, which meant that there was very little life left in the ocean for life to other kinds of forms of shellfish, etc., to live in the forest and survive. And so this project, which is here, the coup, you might just Google that and you'll be able to find some more information on it, is all about trying to think about how to revive these kelp forests so that the sea otters will return. And they're noticing now that there are more sea otters that are returning, and it's very exciting work. So you can follow some of that. And there'll be some places to think about how does mathematics help us learn more about this particular change in the balance between sea urchins and the kelp forest and sea otters. And what is our role in trying to be able to think about that, and what is our role in changing that and making that imbalance, and what is our role in changing it back to balance? So we might think about how climate change has affected what can be harvested at low tide, and maybe think about that globally and locally. And the story of low tide woman, often the phrase that's used is that when the tide goes out, the table is set. And so all these shellfish and various other items, our food we're able to just go out and be able to gather those and harvest those. So how has climate change changed that ability to be able to harvest when the tide is out? What kind of data can we use to collect and help us better understand the change that we're noticing? And how can we use mathematics to help us learn more about these changes so that we can actually do something about it? And who, in terms of not just the humans, but the more than humans, are affected by these changes, and on what time scale? And so is the time scale for humans the same as the time scale for smaller animals or larger animals or non-animate things? So those are some of the questions that I was inspired by thinking about the story of Low Tide Woman. Okay, so now I think I invite Joanne Archibald to help us think about questions and answers with the audience.
Sure, great. So we do welcome your questions either via the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question to any of the presenters. So we'll have a few minutes of questions, discussion, and then we'll return to Billy and Joanne Yovanovich in case I think they might want to say some additional thoughts or share some additional thoughts. I think there was a question earlier about wondering about how one could tell the story, the Ulanai story. We had, I think, Tamara, you had mentioned that you had learned some protocols about telling Indigenous stories and having us think about those protocols, or how one gets permission to tell a story, and an Indigenous story. So I wondered if Billy or Joanne, you'd want to respond to that question. And we are recording this session too, so we have Billy telling the story, which is a good source.
To be able to tell a story, it's more than just knowing the words, it's having the feeling to go with it. And in our culture, you know, telling it properly is a big thing as well. Like, you know, there's probably the odd detail here and there that I don't remember from when I first learned it. I was taught it quite a long time ago, but I've told it so many times. I know, for the most part, I know it, but you know, if I were to ever sit down with my auntie, there's probably one or two little tidbits that I miss. But you know, to be able, like, the big thing of telling this a story is to have that connection and that feeling, as along with, you know, knowing the words of the story to portray your message across.
Thanks, Billy. Yes, you know, I certainly can relate to that, having learned stories from Stalo and Coast Salish elders, where, you know, that stories are a core part of Indigenous cultures, ways of knowing, you know, and I think, Tamara, you had mentioned too, being able to get the students and yourself story work ready to learn about a principle of responsibility and learning how to listen. And then Billy, you talked about then also, how do you feel a story? It's, you know, that becomes part of, you know, sort of an embedded experience.
There's a nice question in the chat about math as a special friend. So Billy, would you or anyone have some ideas about thinking about math as a special friend in story? How has math become a special friend for you, Billy?
Well, that was kind of why I picked to tell that story. Was, I know it didn't have any, you know, it wasn't a math heavy thing or anything, but it was more as a metaphor to use because, you know, I live, you know, essentially kind of a cultural style of life. Whether I'm out on the land or I'm at work working on any of my carvings or paintings, it always kind of rears its head like, what was that? I want to say it was probably about 15 years ago when I did the drawing presentation at UBC in front of everyone. You know, it wasn't a math heavy thing, but it was a way to get everyone to look at it from a different angle, to try invoke these new ideas, this new way of thinking. And, you know, doing our art, especially with at least Haida form line, we have, you know, we have a ratio of, you know, there's the thick, like on my shirt, you could see up here, it's much thicker than it is down here. And so we have that kind of 2-to-1 ratio. And then in the negative space, that ratio is repeated. And then this just being one color, of course, it doesn't show it, but in designs that have multiple colors, you're trying to balance your colors out. And so, you know, you all of a sudden you have all of these patterns and these repeating cycles of the rules to form line. And, you know, back when I was just a young kid drawing all the time, I didn't think much of it. And then having the opportunity to work alongside you and mom, like doing the mathematical mouse woman hands, I consciously did, you know, she has all 5 of her fingers, but her 4 fingers are red, her thumbs are black. And so, you know, you can count them and notice, so there's this change here, and the pattern is different. And so, you know, these are all mathematical words. And, you know, it was, I just thought of them as words in my vocabulary, not words associated with math.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
I think also we when we met Billy, you talked about the that the story you told can be related back to that uneasy relationship that some people have with math and that turbulence. So I don't know if you can speak more on that, or.
Yeah, it like, it's to not every, it's to, like, that different way of thinking. It helps other people learn. Like, some people learn visually, they see it. Other people, they have to hear you kind of explain it to them. But then, when you have like, um, for instance, your last slide with solving for X and um, balancing equations, that you hear that heavy vocabulary and you're like, oh geez, like I don't know what I'm doing. But then if you have someone to, break it down into parts and show you these pieces, you know a lot more than you think you do. But looking at it in a book and reading it, you kind of go, oh gee, I don't know what I'm doing. And so you think it's too difficult to do. But you have, to have these new ways of thinking to integrate into curriculums. Some kids would notice these patterns in a different way, like doing my drawing. um, I was working in the Souk school district, and I did that drawing presentation with kids from grade 1 all the way to grade 12. And I noticed in every group there was always, not every kid got it. Some kids did. But as I went around the classroom doing it, I also noticed, and even with art in general, you notice people see things that don't, you're not consciously doing. Like, it's oh, you did this little face here, and you're like, oh, I didn't even see that little face there. And so it's interesting to see the different ways in which people get to the same solution, I guess. And so that's, kind of how this story, I looked at it as, if we can make that relationship with it, if somebody can show you, hey, I have this relationship with it, you can too. Like, it's not just my special bond. Like, anybody can have this bond, with anything, essentially.
Great. So I wonder if we could ask Joanne Yovanovich if you wanted to share some thoughts thinking about your special bond to Billy.
Hello, Joanne. I'm happy to be joining you. Billy and I are here on Haida, our ancestral land of the Haida Nation. I had some thoughts about the stories and about culturally responsive work, especially like in math. Sometimes it's hard to find the cultural connections. And so one of the things in our district is to always be asking questions about, and on the slide, what are the cultural connections in your work? And really important things is to always remember and think about, how do you acknowledge stories, images, any objects? I was thinking sometimes we borrow our auntie's best cedar basket to use in a lesson. How do we acknowledge that that basket, is on loan, or if by chance they gave it to us? How do we acknowledge those, the stories, the objects, the images? And that is like really important in this work, is to always have that in your mind and have that reflected in your work. What are the reasons for using a story, an object? How and what is it connected to? And how is it relevant? Or is it something that you just decided to use? And even if it was something that you just decided to use, how would you acknowledge that? And how, I guess, how do people look at your work or participate in your work? And how do they know that the story is about Ilmagai, say, for instance? How do we know that? How do we know how that flows through the work? Does it only show up once? Does it show up a few times? And then like how does that connect to past lessons, past units, and how does that inspire you for future work, future lessons? Those are like kind of big, broad questions, but very important questions. For me, really important, the piece of acknowledging stories, acknowledging when you acquire knowledge. And I was happy to hear, people acknowledging where they were given the stories from, and that they're able to share the stories. And that's, as teachers and people that work in education, because we are so strapped with the clock all the time, sometimes it's easy to forget those parts. And so I just really wanted to make sure to really emphasize that important aspect of acknowledging the knowledge that you use or the objects that you use. I don't know if anybody has any questions or thoughts about that one. I would be interested to hear.
I have a thought connected to how do you return to the story? And I'm reminded of Richard Wagamisi's comment that we are all stories and like we're living a story. And I think when we hear a story and we hear it told again and again, it becomes part of our collective story. And then we refer to it like, do you remember when? And this reminds me of, and then it becomes a part of our everyday conversation.
And lastly, Billy, I just wanted to ask you if you could talk about Low Tide Woman, how she controls the tide, if you could sort of do that one quick, because I don't know that piece was there.
So the poll that I did, it was of Low Tide Woman, and she had all of those figures that you would see at the low tide line. In Ulanai, there's the story of that Chinai who he controlled the tide. It seems like there was multiple beings who controlled the tide, and it's probably, within their areas or something to that effect. But the story of Chihu Jinjat was another story who you'd never guess who the guy was that figured out how to control the tide with her. It was, of course, Raven again. And in that story with her, he's been traveling and he's been flying over land, and he's kind of sick of picking away at these things that he finds on land, and he's kind of scavenging here and there but not finding much. And so he goes to Chihu Jinjat, and he's kind of pleading his case, telling her he's so hungry and he wants to eat, and she could really help him out by moving the tide for him. But she kind of, no, I don't want to play your games. And so Raven, he tricks her, and she can't see him, but he tells her, oh, I have a gooding eye in my hand, and I'm going to rub it on your feet or on your back. And she kind of gets a little tense about it and thinks, oh, Jesus, is he actually going to try attack me with this sea urchin? And but Raven, being Raven, he's got a plan for that, and he grabs a blue spruce branch, and he comes up behind her, and he starts rubbing the spruce bough on her back, and it causes her legs to kick out. And or her legs to kick in, they curl up because she kind of tenses up, and as her legs move, so does the tide. So when they're out, the tide is in, and when she pulls her feet in, the tide, it goes out from her. And so again, in that story, he gets the tide to go out, and he heads out and he has himself a feast, and he's on his merry way. But yeah, that's the idea of her, was she was another being who controlled the tide and was another one who fell victim to Raven's tricks.
Christine says in the chat, I love the imagery of the raven. Yeah, we can just see her raven doing these tricks. Andrea says, the story of Raven made me think of productive struggle in mathematics and First People's principles of learning. The concept that learning takes time. It's not always easy, but if we're patient, we'll see the rewards. And that comes from the Ulanai story as well. Ulanai story. Promoting positive mathematical attitudes is so important in many classrooms. Yeah, and I think we can use or think about, how would Raven as trickster even think about how to solve this problem? How would Raven approach a problem, and think about it differently, or come at it from another angle? Or Raven's always got something that Raven can do to get you out of this and make you make that special friend. Mathematics be that special friend. So you've given me lots to think about, Billy.
Yeah, I agree, Cynthia, that, I love this idea that, math is our friend, and that's a fresh start to think, because sometimes, math, students can be afraid of math, or do not feel successful. But if we think math can be our friend, and we can learn with our friend, and we can be challenged by our friend too. And I also, I've appreciated that the Raven, and, getting us maybe to think outside of what we've been thinking about, to have a bit of fun, or to be with that Raven at times, to try and be creative, or need to be, to problem solve, or to be reminded that there are some good teachings that we can turn to, Indigenous ways of knowing, having patience, listening, being responsible, and also at the same time addressing key questions. I love the questions that have been posed, to think about, the guiding questions, Joanne, you've given to us, to really have us think about how we connect story to our math practice, and that the story continues to be a part of what we do. So it's not just a one time, but just like a friend, it's one that we have to work at to have friendship. But we get to know that friend or that story. And Billy, you've also reinforced that important idea for us to really get to know the story, know it in ways through our heart, mind, body, and spirit. So then we can share, tell the story, share it if somebody else told it, whether it's in video or a book or in some way, but we have, you know, some ethical guidelines about how that story may be then brought into our teaching and introduced to the children, so the students, so that they could learn to work with the story in good ways. That we have had through our curriculum responders today, wonderful teaching approaches that get the students ready to learn about responsibility, to think about balance, to actually learn by doing, and having stories by our side to help us learn perhaps balance, or learning to listen, or understanding what mentorship means. So we've actually been given such a feast of ideas through stories that are both traditional and life experience stories, that we can appreciate, Billy, your work as a wonderful artist and how you have brought together the stories with your art and with math, and it all comes together in such a beautiful way. So thank you to our presenters today for this wonderful feast. And I think we just have some closing things, Cynthia, to share with everybody about what's next,
Yeah.
maybe?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you to all of our curriculum responders, me and Tamara and Courtney and Joanne and Billy for joining, and for everyone putting in some very thoughtful questions in the chat. We have now a poll that Kelvin is just going to release, just ask you a couple questions, but I'm also going to send you a link to a little larger poll. Then there will be, if you fill it out, you'll get your name entered into a draw for some nice gifts that are related to Indigenous math education. So while you're filling out this poll, though, I want to just mention to you that the Indigenous Math Education Symposium registration is now open. And the symposium is May 14th and May 21st. There's a QR code there if you'd like to register. And we have, in the first session, we'll have storyteller, world-renowned, award-winning storyteller Richard Van Camp, who will speak in the first session, and we'll have some interaction with him, thinking about how stories and mathematics can come together. A beautiful segue from what we've been talking about today to what we'll be doing in the symposium. And the second session is the following week on the 21st at the same time. And this is where educators are sharing a bit about the projects that they're working on, very quick kind of overviews of things that they've been working on. These are just some examples of working on a seasonal calendar, drumming, using Susan Point's artist spiral whirls as a way to think about mathematics, and Stan Manud talking about beading, and some of the things are happening in his own culture and beating those into these hypersquares. These are examples of presentations in the past, and they can all be found on the Indigenous Math Education website. So hope to see you at the symposium, which again is in May. And we want to thank everybody again for attending the series over the last number of months. We've had 4 of them, one every 2 months or so. And this theme has been just really exciting. So I've really enjoyed thinking more about with you on centering Indigenous pedagogies for mathematics teaching and learning. So thank you again for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next academic year for our next series. And if you have some ideas about that, you can tell us what those might be in the next link that I'll send you, to be able to enter your name into a draw and to give us a little bit more feedback. So thank you, everybody.